What if I told you that the most important room in medieval Europe was no bigger than your living room? No castle towers, no stained glass windows, no knights in shining armour. Just a low wooden door, a roof of straw, and a single room filled with smoke. For nearly 90% of Europeans in the Middle Ages, this was home. And tonight, instead of walking through a grand cathedral or a royal palace, we're going somewhere far more revealing. We're stepping inside a peasant hut, the place where history was not written, but lived. Before we push open that creaky wooden door, take a second to support the journey. If you enjoy exploring the quieter corners of history like this, go ahead and like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if at any point you find yourself thinking, I never knew that that is your cue to join our growing community of curious minds. Now, let us step inside. The year is around 1200. The village is small, maybe 20 or 30 families. Most people here will never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. The house in front of us is built from wattle and daub, thin wooden strips woven together and sealed with a mix of clay straw and even animal dung. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these structures in places like Warren Percy in England, abandoned after the 14th century. What remains are shallow outlines in the soil, post holes, bits of pottery, quiet proof of ordinary lives. The roof above is thick thatch. It looks charming in modern fairy tales. In reality, it must be replaced every few years. It keeps out rain. Mostly, it keeps in warmth. Sometimes. Now open the door. The first thing you notice is the smoke. There is no chimney. In many peasant homes before the late medieval period, the fire burned in the centre of the room. Smoke drifted upward and slowly escaped through the thatch. Your eyes sting a little. The air smells of wood, earth and animals. Yes, animals. In winter, a goat or a pig might sleep inside. Not because peasants were careless, but because shared body heat meant survival. When temperatures dropped during what historians call the medieval warm period's later cooling phases, every degree mattered. The entire house is likely one room, perhaps 15 by 20 feet. A family of 5 or 6 lives here. The floor is packed dirt, sometimes layered with straw for insulation. A wooden chest holds their most valuable belongings, maybe a wool cloak, a cooking pot, a few carved spoons. There are no glass windows, just shutters. And yet, this hut is not a symbol of failure. It is a symbol of adaptation. Between the years 1000 and 1300, Europe's population may have doubled, rising from roughly 40 million to over 70 million people. That growth did not happen in castles. It happened in homes like this. Inside these smoky walls, children were born. Bread was baked. Stories were told by firelight. History did not belong only to kings. It belonged to the people who slept on straw rows before dawn and quietly kept the world turning. And as the fire crackles in the centre of this small room, we're about to discover what an ordinary day inside these walls truly felt like, from the moment the rooster calls, to the last ember fading into darkness. As the first thin line of light slips through the wooden shutters, the hut begins to stir. There is no alarm clock, no glowing screen, just the sound of a rooster somewhere beyond the fields, and the quiet understanding that work cannot wait. In medieval Europe, especially between the 11th and 14th centuries, life moved with the sun. Church bells, if the village had a church nearby, marked the hours of prayer and subtly structured the day. Historians studying manorial records from 13th century England show that peasants often owed labour services to their lord, sometimes 2 or 3 days each week, in addition to working their own narrow strips of land in the open field system. Imagine that balance for a moment. You work your own field to feed your family, and you also work someone else's land because that is the agreement that allows you to live there. It was not slavery in most cases, but it was obligation. A web of duties tying landlord and labour together. By sunrise, someone is already outside. Perhaps the father guiding an ox pulling a heavy wooden plough. The heavy plough, introduced widely in northern Europe around the 10th century, was one of the quiet technological revolutions of the Middle Ages. It allowed farmers to turn the dense soils of regions like northern France and England more effectively, increasing yields. Progress did not always wear armour. Sometimes it looked like better farming tools. Inside the hut, the mother might be spinning wool using a drop spindle. Wool production was central to many medieval economies. In fact, by the 14th century, English wool exports were so valuable that the crown taxed them heavily to fund wars. Children were not idle either. A boy might scare birds away from freshly planted seeds. A girl might gather firewood or help with animals. Childhood existed, but it was woven into responsibility early. Now here is something that might surprise you. Medieval peasants did not work every single day of the year without pause. The church calendar included numerous feast days. Some historians estimate that peasants in certain regions observed as many as 80 or more religious holidays annually. On those days, labour slowed. There was music, dancing, shared food, hard work, and real celebration. Does that contrast with how we live now? When was the last time your entire community stopped working at the same time just to celebrate? Still, harvest season was relentless. In late summer and early autumn, everyone worked from dawn until dusk. Crops had to be gathered quickly before rain could destroy months of effort. Failure meant hunger in winter. Life in this hut was not dramatic most days. It was steady, predictable in rhythm, unpredictable in outcome. And as the sun sets after a long day in the fields, smoke once again curls upward from the hearth. The family gathers close, tired, but together. Now comes the most fragile part of their existence, the part that sits quietly on every wooden table. Food. And what filled their bowls may surprise you more than anything we have seen so far. Peasants were not constantly starving skeletons barely surviving. In most average harvest years, they consumed enough calories to sustain heavy labour. Studies of skeletal remains from medieval England and northern France show signs of repetitive strain from work, yes, but not universal signs of chronic malnutrition. Their diet was simple grain, heavy and repetitive, but usually sufficient. However, the margin for error was razor thin. Between the years 1315 and 1317, relentless rain led to the Great Famine in northern Europe. Contemporary chroniclers describe crop failures, livestock disease, and soaring grain prices. Some regions may have lost up to 10% of their population. Imagine this hut during those years, the same pot, the same fire, but far less inside the bowl. Would you have saved seed for planting next year, or fed it to your hungry child tonight? These were the kinds of decisions families faced. Ale also deserves a mention. It was not the strong craft beer you might enjoy today. It was weak, lightly fermented, and often safer to drink than water from shallow wells. Even children consumed diluted versions. Brewing was often a domestic task, usually managed by women. Food was not just survival, it was community. When harvest was good, neighbours gathered. Bread ovens were sometimes shared. A pig slaughter became a village event. The smell of baking bread drifting across a cold morning was more than comfort. It was reassurance. And yet every meal carried an unspoken awareness. What if next year is different? What if the rains do not stop? What if illness comes? Because inside this hut, survival was physical. But it was also emotional. It lived in the quiet space between hope and fear. And that brings us to something even more powerful than hunger. What did medieval peasants believe when the harvest failed, when disease struck, when life felt fragile beyond control? Inside these smoky walls there was another presence, invisible but deeply felt. Faith. When the wind howled outside and the fire inside burned low, there was something else in that hut besides smoke and shadows. Belief. For a medieval peasant, the world was not divided into natural and supernatural. It was all woven together. The harvest, the weather, illness, childbirth, everything carried meaning. Most villages centred around a small parish church. Church bells marked the hours. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, life unfolded under its rhythm. In England alone, by the early 14th century, there were roughly 9,000 parish churches, serving a population of about 4 to 5 million people. That means faith was not distant, it was local, personal, Inside the hut you might find a small wooden cross hanging near the hearth. Perhaps a simple carving of a saint, not decoration protection. Life expectancy in medieval Europe hovered around 30 to 40 years at birth, largely because of high infant mortality. Many children did not survive their first 5 years. If you were a parent in that hut, faith was not abstract theology. It was comfort. It was hope when medicine could offer little. And then came the Black Death. In the year 1347, plague arrived in Europe. Within 4 years, historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population died. In some villages, entire households disappeared. Parish records from England show abrupt gaps in burials, then sudden surges. In certain areas, labour shortages became so severe that fields went unploughed. Imagine standing inside this hut during that time. You hear the church bell toll again and again. Would you question your faith or cling to it tighter? Some people believed the plague was divine punishment. Others searched for scapegoats. Some turned to prayer processions. In a world without germ theory, people reached for explanations that made emotional sense. But faith was not only fear, it shaped the calendar. Christmas, Easter, harvest festivals, these moments brought colour to life. Mystery plays performed biblical stories in village squares. Even ordinary peasants could see themselves as part of a grand cosmic story. And yes, there were superstitions too. Charms against illness. Herbs hung near doorways. Folk beliefs passed quietly from grandmother to child. Not ignorance, but attempts to understand uncertainty. Here is something worth reflecting on. When modern life feels unstable, where do we turn to use community prayer? Medieval peasants turned to what gave them meaning. Inside that smoky hut, surrounded by fragile walls and unpredictable seasons, belief gave structure to fear. It helped people endure losses we can barely imagine. But there was something else just as powerful holding these villages together. Not kings, not castles, community. And that final piece might be the most surprising of all. Step just outside the hut for a moment. Not far. Just beyond the doorway where the packed earth path connects one home to another. Because medieval life was not lived alone. If one family's roof collapsed in a storm, neighbours helped rebuild it. When harvest came, fields were cut in groups. Under the open field system common in England and parts of France and Germany, land was divided into long strips scattered across large shared fields. No neat fenced properties, no private lawns. Your strip might sit beside your neighbours, and cooperation was not optional, it was survival. Manorial court records from the 13th century show villagers settling disputes over wandering livestock, shared ploughs and boundary lines. These were not silent peasants waiting for orders. They argued. They negotiated. They enforced local rules. Community also meant shared resources. Some villages had communal ovens where families baked bread together. Mills often owned by the lord ground grain for multiple households. Yes, there were fees. Yes, obligations existed. But daily life required interaction. And here is something many people overlook. Medieval peasants were not passive victims trapped forever in silence. In the year 1381, during the English Peasants' Revolt, thousands of common people marched toward London protesting heavy taxation and labour restrictions that followed the Black Death. They demanded change. They spoke directly to the young King Richard II. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed, it revealed something powerful. Peasants understood injustice, and they were capable of collective action. Inside these simple huts lived people with agency, with opinions, with courage. Now let me ask you something gently. When we imagine medieval peasants, do we see only poverty? Or do we see human beings building networks of support long before modern governments existed? Life expectancy was shorter. Comfort was limited. But social bonds were strong. You likely knew every face in your village. You attended the same church, worked the same soil, shared the same fears when storms rolled in. In some ways, isolation, the kind many of us feel today despite living among millions, was rarer. That does not mean life was easier. It means it was shared. And as we step back inside the hut one final time as the fire glows softly and voices quiet down, we begin to see something unexpected. This was not just a place of hardship, it was a place of dignity. And in our final moments together we will gather all these threads, smoke, labour, hunger, faith, community, and ask one last question. What does this small hut still have to teach us today? And then, almost quietly, the empire that once called itself eternal began to fracture. By the late 4th century, Rome was no longer ruled from Rome. In 330, Emperor Constantine had already shifted the centre of power eastward to Constantinople. By 395, the empire was permanently divided into eastern and western halves. It looked like a strategic decision. In reality, it was an admission the system was too vast, too strained, too fragile to hold together as one. Let me ask you something. How does something that dominates the known world for centuries begin to fall apart, not with a single explosion? Not with one dramatic betrayal, but with pressure, slow, relentless, compounding. The Western Roman Empire was bleeding economically. Decades of civil wars had drained the treasury. Heavy taxation crushed farmers. According to historical estimates, by the 5th century, some regions had lost up to half of their population due to plague war and economic collapse. When fewer people produce goods and pay taxes, who funds the legions, who repairs the roads, who maintains the aqueducts that once symbolized Roman brilliance. Meanwhile, Rome increasingly relied on Germanic mercenaries to defend its borders. Think about that. The empire that once trained the most disciplined army in the ancient world was now outsourcing its security. In 410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome. For the first time in nearly 800 years, the so-called Eternal City fell to a foreign enemy. St. Jerome, writing at the time, famously asked, "Who could believe that Rome, built up by the conquest of the whole world, had fallen? And yet it did not end there." In 455, the Vandals sacked Rome again. By 476, the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. No dramatic final battle, no cinematic last stand. Just a quiet removal of a young emperor whose name ironically meant Little Augustus. That is how giants fall, not always with thunder, sometimes with paperwork. But here is the part that always gives me chills. Rome did not truly disappear. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, survived for nearly 1,000 more years. Roman law influenced modern legal systems. Roman roads shaped European trade routes. Even today, we measure time, architecture and governance through ideas born in that ancient world. So maybe the real question is not why Rome fell. Maybe it is this: what parts of Rome are still standing inside our own societies. History is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror. When economies strain, when politics divide, when leaders ignore long-term stability for short-term power, are we really so different? Thank you for staying with this journey through the rise and fall of one of history's greatest civilizations. If this story made you see the modern world a little differently, then stay close, because the next story we explore might feel even more familiar than you expect.